Nelson Poynter and his legacy during the 20th century in Pinellas County and St. Petersburg, and about what he contributed and how he affected the institutions that he was involved with. Today, primarily talking about the St. Pete Times and the Evening Independent that they used to have, as well as Congressional Quarterly and the Poynter Institute. It's an educational institution, and it has evolved, I'm sure, beyond what even he had imagined, but his primary interest in establishing it, from what I can determine from his papers and from what he had to say about it, had to do with creating educational opportunities for journalists. And my understanding is that's still largely what it does, but that was his primary interest, to advance the education of young journalists as well as more advanced journalists into becoming better writers and reporters and editorialists and all the various aspects of being in the media business. It's expanded far beyond just newspapers now. It goes into all forms of media. What a accomplished, dedicated businessman he was. He always believed in his causes. He was definitely a liberal, but he was also a businessman and believed in making money because that's what it took in order to succeed, and for his newspaper and his other endeavors and enterprises to succeed, they had to be profitable. So that aspect of it really was never made a big thing of in any news reports or anything I'd ever heard about him. I've titled this, as you can see, His Legacy in the American Century, and I'm going to preface my presentation here with a few remarks explaining that. David S. Mason, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Butler University, wrote in the introduction to an article in the Phi Kappa Phi Forum, "The American Century as a term was the title of an influential essay written in 1941 for Life magazine by its publisher, Henry Luce. As Hitler's armies stormed across Europe, Luce called on the U.S. to shoulder world leadership, come to the defense of Allied Britain in the wake of Nazi blitzes, and promote, encourage, and incite so-called democratic principles throughout the world. Such action would inspire us, Americans, to live and work and fight with vigor and enthusiasm, and in turn create the first great American century." Nelson Poynter, who was a longtime editor and publisher of the St. Pete Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, was very much a participant in that American century and contributed to it in many ways unknown to most people. Even though his political leanings were usually different from those of Luce, he embodied that spirit of the American century that his contemporary described. Communities and institutions of which Poynter was a part, some of which he founded and developed, owe no small measure of their present character to his lifetime of activism on behalf of causes he believed would protect or improve the lives of Americans. At the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg is a library that now bears his name. A collection of Poynter's papers sheds light on the man and his era. In this presentation, I'll try to put the legacy of Nelson Poynter in the context of his times. However, first I want to establish some of the background of the papers, photos, and audio-video tapes that make up the collection that this production, that you'll see in a few minutes, is derived from, and to explain a little of the context of my involvement with the project. This presentation is a partial and preliminary version of my expected video documentary, which will be due in December on the Nelson Poynter collection. The project is being created for my Master's in Liberal Arts degree at USF St. Pete. I first became aware of the Poynter papers back in June when I began researching and annotating the papers as part of a directed research project for my postgraduate degree, which is focused in history. Even though I have an undergraduate degrees in political science and history, most of my adult life was spent in the field of marketing and advertising. That work included TV and video production for clients' advertising and training. In 1998, I began transitioning to the field of teaching and ended up as a TV and film production teacher in Pinellas County school system. Because of these interests, I've long been attracted to historical documentaries. My discovery of the Poynter collection seemed to me an ideal subject for such a documentary. What I will present today is just the beginning of that process. Before Nelson Poynter died in 1978, the educational organization he created, then called the Modern Media Institute, because he didn't want it called after himself, but now called the Poynter Institute, filmed a series of interviews with Mr. Poynter about his life, career, and philosophy. In the early 80s, Governor Bob Graham initiated an oral history program to preserve the words, thoughts, and stories about some of Florida's leading figures from different areas of our culture. Nelson Poynter was one of the subjects chosen, and numerous hours of audio and video were recorded of the Poynter family and Poynter's family and professional associates. Sometime after Mr. Poynter's death, the St. Pete Times gave his papers to the Nelson Poynter Memorial Library, of which Jim is the archivist, at the USF St. Pete campus. These papers include video of the filmed interviews and many personal and family photographs from as early as the beginning of the 20th century. A few years later, Governor Graham gave the tapes and transcripts of the Oral History Project to the library to be part of the Poynter archives. Before my recent research, it appears that primary work with the collection was conducted about 30 years ago when David Shedden, a young USF graduate student, carefully cataloged the entire collection, now contained in 16 file drawers. David also participated in Governor Graham's Oral History Project, performing some of the interviews. Today, David Shedden is the librarian and archivist for the Poynter Institute. My presentation today includes some video and audio clips I've edited to tell the story of Nelson Poynter's legacy as it relates to St. Petersburg and to Pinellas County, through his own words and those of his colleagues and associates. This story includes some aspects of his life apart from this area because that is important to understanding who he was and the context of the world in which he lived. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what I've put together for today. So we'll get started here now.
Well, I came to St. Petersburg directly from Yale in the summer of 1927 because the boom was over. The Times Publishing Company, which had been acquired by my father in 1912, largely at the prodding of my mother, who had come to Florida with her father in the 80s, and we had spent winters at New Smyrna. And so this was part of a small chain of papers that my father had. The Kokomo Dispatch in Indiana, the Seymour Democrat, the Sullivan paper, the original family paper, Columbus, Indiana, Noblesville, Indiana, later the Hickory Record in North Carolina. And because of the enormous debt incurred during the boom in building that 8-story building in which we still operate, it's been added to, of course, a great deal in the last 50 years. I learned the business side of newspapering pretty fast. It was a crash course, literally. And among the assets was the Clearwater Sun. And so I had a crash course in Clearwater, too, because I knew the paper had to be sold. So I got it in shape, advertised it for sale, found a buyer, and I made $25,000 on that deal. It was a great deal of money, and I thought it was quite natural that a Yale graduate who was, well, let's see, I would have been about 25 years old, would make $25,000 his first year out of college, and thought nothing of it. But I also bought the Kokomo Dispatch. And then came the stock market crash in 1929, and the Dispatch was deeply in debt. and so was I personally. So I lost my $25,000. Father needed help. There was more of a burden of management on him, and he was still deeply in debt with a scattered bunch of creditors. And I felt I could be of some real help there, but I previously had a family option whereby I've said repeatedly, you know, I love my family. It's a strong bunch of individuals, my sister, my mother, my father. And I knew I did not want to publish a newspaper with any one or all of them. That would be impossible. I just am too jealous of my own independence there to be able to work in that frame. So I started buying the paper, paying off some of the debts to reclaim the collateral of the stock of the Times and that kind of thing. And this went on for a number of years until 1947, when I got majority stock, and I've been consolidating that ever since. That's all I want, is to put out the best newspaper in the country. I think I can contribute more to self-government by setting a standard of integrity, of public service, and financial success by concentrating on the newspaper business. And so that is the thread. Thank goodness I've lived long enough to have at least partially achieved that high goal. No one who is a perfectionist, and I admit to being so, is ever satisfied, of course, with a picture or a piece of music or a garden. But you can at least do your best and still know that it can be better. And I think that we have the foundation for doing that.
We give a tremendous amount of space to politics. Self-government, of course, is the most important thing we have to preserve and promote and implement. I don't think we can have self-government without newspapers. And if newspapers are going to reflect only one party or one candidate, we don't get the wholesome competition at the voting booth that makes self-government work in the last analysis. So first of all, we give a lot of free space. Of course, no candidate, no party will ever think that you're giving enough space to their side. And therefore, instead of handbills, a more efficient, more economical way of reaching large numbers of people is through advertising. When I came here in 1938, we charged, like most newspapers, charged a very high premium for political advertising. That was true of circus advertising. If they could get it, because that was the only access they had to the public, publishers generally charged them a very high price for it. We changed that. We gave them the same rates as a merchant who would use an equal amount of space, so that we made first-class citizens, in my judgment, of political candidates and political parties. I have worked in Washington off and on since 1923, when I had my first job as reporter there with Scripps Howard at the Washington Daily News, which was quite new at that time. And over the years, I realized how badly Congress was reported. Quite literally, as a reader or as an editor, it was impossible for you to reconstruct the voting record of your two senators or your congressman. In the case of an election, the election would long be over before you could really give your readers, as a writer on politics and public affairs, a clear picture of their three representatives in the Congress. And so we set out to do something about that. It had been tried a few times before, in the latter part of the 19th century. Paul Douglas, in his memoirs, mentions this. And of course, like so many experiments of that kind, it involves more work and money than the people who enthusiastically get the idea started. And so that has changed. I meet young newspaper people in Washington frequently and am introduced as chairman of the board of Congressional Quarterly and one of the founders of it. And they're astonished that I'm still living because they think it's been there forever, since the beginning of the Republic, I think. And they're astonished to know that it really started in the middle 40s. It's something that does help self-government work better. Through other writers and broadcasters and teachers, because it has a tremendous constituency among the schools, high schools as well as colleges. It even gets into some grammar schools. They know considerably more about that third branch of government. So this has expanded political and public affairs coverage. And it's very easy to go back and reconstruct the debate on this or that of any important issue up to 30 years ago now. I got out of college rather young, and in those days they didn't have these traveling fellowships. And I had grown up during World War I, and my great heroes at that time naturally were the war correspondents. And I wanted to see the world, and so I worked my way out there. I was headed for China because that was the only place that the war was going on at the time. Several months later, when I got there, the war was over. It was one of these warlord things. And so my money ran out, of course, even though I had worked my way there. And I got a job on the Japan Times. It was an English language newspaper. They said they didn't have a job. And I said, well, like all papers, they were short-handed. I thought they were. And I said, well, could I just work around here, not charge you for it? And I was able to produce enough printable copy in a relatively short time that they were sort of ashamed of themselves and put me on the payroll. I learned an awful lot exposing. I traveled the cheapest way because that was the only way I could afford, and it was a great education itself. The idealism of Woodrow Wilson in World War I and the fight in the Versailles Treaty and all was very new at that time, all over the world. And there were these young politicians in the Philippines, for instance, who were wide-eyed, starry-eyed over the concept that they could have self-government, that war really was the war to make the world safe for democracy. And I met some of the people who were later leaders. They were young and interested in public affairs, and so a young newspaper man naturally would meet them and all. And so it gave me a feeling and a glimpse for many parts of the world that I still retain to this day. That's one reason why I have never been really afraid of communism. It won't work. And there are these there are these seeds of idealism in all the countries of the world, that you can suppress them for over 30 years, 40 years, like Franco did in Spain. And once you just let that cork, the least bit out of the bottle, these ideas that are so much better than communism will come out. And that's why you know, we can't afford to sell the idea of self-government short.
Did you and Nelson like each other from the beginning? Do you remember?
I would say yes. He was a friendly sort of a man. I liked the expression in his face, liked his eyes. They were brown, weren't they?
Mm-hmm.
And we became good friends, and remained so for, well, until he died. We had many encounters, all friendly. Friendly because we reached an understanding very early in our relationship. The understanding was that there were certain subjects on which we could probably not agree, many subjects on which we could agree. They were the subjects like what's good for St. Petersburg, what can be done to improve life in St. Petersburg. On that subject, we were in complete agreement all the time. Nelson, as you know, was a very compassionate man, and he had a great interest in the other people, especially people who had not been so fortunate. And that trait, I think, caused him to be misunderstood by some people who felt he was too much inclined to help the underdog. And in fact, so much so that they felt he had socialistic tendencies.
Or even communistic.
Oh, well, I wasn't going to say that.
If you had to describe Nelson in a word or a phrase, how would you describe him?
I would describe him as a very conscientious, knowing where he was going. You know, Nelson was never uncertain about things. He was rather a positive person in my contacts with him, and he was a very caring person. Now, I know that I have, in my 50 years of community and civic work here in St. Petersburg, that I never had to call Nelson Poynter one time, ever. I never had asked Nelson for a favor. Nelson always called me. When he would see that I was chairman of something, he'd call and say, "Catherine, what can the Times and Independent do for you to help you with your project?"
How much do you need?
He was one.
I always felt that I had achieved something by being able to work with Nelson as long as I had, because he was a very tough fellow to work for. He was tough in the sense that he demanded a good sense of perfection, and I think in my working relationship with he and the Times, I felt that by maintaining a long relationship, I had certainly achieved what I thought was one of his greatest characteristics, and that was the people I saw around him were selected. He certainly chose them well, and he, as far as I could see, he demanded of each of the people that worked with him a great deal. So he got a lot for his money.
Mm-hmm. He demanded a lot of you too.
Sure.
And regarded Jack Holland as one of his good friends, really good
he
friends.
did. You know, now, I remember when they were trying to established the University of South Florida here. Nelson was very, as you know, interested in it. And he felt that we had to have a good library before we could sell that to the state to have a branch here. So I remember that he called Ed Wright and Jack Holland, and he said, look, I want this because I want to establish it. And you know, when Nelson spoke, you helped him.
Well, yes. And then on the other hand, when you spoke, he helped you.
That's right.
I told Nelson, you know, I'm not real liberal. He said, oh, yes, you are, Charles, or you wouldn't be a friend of mine. But I think Nelson, after Henrietta passed away, she also died of a cerebral hemorrhage, as you probably know.
Yes.
That he became less liberal and more considerate, we'll say, of the middle of the road. Of course, I think this may be true of everyone. The older they live, the more conservative they become.
And the richer they get.
Well, I was a little reluctant to say that.
I think that is a factor.
I always remember, once I asked Nelson, because you remember the early stories that he was a communist and
Sure.
he belonged to the party and all
Sure,
that business.
carried his card in his
And
shoe.
he was trying desperately to get a radio station and also a TV station. I said, well, what do you want with a radio station? He said, one thing, Charles, make money.
After all this talk, you're so conscious of the inadequacy of a few anecdotes to sum up this extraordinary life of a man as richly variegated as Nelson Poynter. The man had endless strengths and made countless contributions. And that poor words such as I can summon are so inadequate to describe who he was and what he meant. But I somehow believe that the enduring, ongoing monuments that he left here, the St. Petersburg Times, Congressional Quarterly, the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, will demonstrate, as the years go on, what the life of that founder meant. And he was, in every sense, the founder of this enormous enterprise that is so highly motivated and so successful. Successful materially, because he believed, without saying it, because it's a little too biblical for him, that bread cast on the waters does return manyfold. He believed that quality was its own reward, and that if you do things, as he put it, better, faster, and cheaper in American free enterprise, then you'll get your reward. And certainly through the St. Petersburg Times and its growth, devoted to quality and the very highest ideals, that it has led to the assembly here of extraordinary people on its staff and to an extraordinary readership to whom it's totally dedicated and independent of any other newspaper connection. So how do you describe the man who made all that possible? The answer is that I can't, you can't. But this is just a few notes, certainly not the overall whole picture of a man who was so much larger than I can find words to describe.
This has been David Shedden talking with Mr. Eugene Patterson, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Times Publishing Company, for Governor Bob Graham's oral history program honoring the late Nelson Poynter. Thank you, Mr. Patterson.
Okay, just one quick note about all of those things, that those videos, everything you see here is in the Poynter collection. The video, there's, as I said, 16 file cabinets full of papers, file drawers full of papers, which to me was very fascinating, the fact that all of his correspondence, memos, notes, and whatnot, tracked exactly what you heard here from his friends and acquaintances and co-workers and what he said. So it's kind of an interesting thing to be able to see what people are saying. And I actually spent the summer reading and going through, annotating his papers, so I was pretty familiar with his ideas, his thoughts, and the people he dealt with before we discovered all of the videos here. There's also dozens of audio tapes as well. But I thought this would make a good overview of how he was in the context of the period of time he lived in, the people he dealt with, and I was particularly happy to find all those videos over 30 years ago. I didn't take them, so I just found them and edited them, that fit right with the theme that seemed to be developing from what I was reading. So, any questions that comes to mind from seeing this to anybody? Does anything occur to you that you wonder about? Yes, ma'am.
It was mentioned that the political ads had the same rate as the business ads. Is that still true?
You know what? Your question was about whether or not the political ads still have the same rate as the business ads. I know that there are special rates usually for newspaper, but I have to tell you, newspapers are not nearly as important in the political realm today as they were in 1977 when he made those comments and before. So it's not as an important of an aspect. You know, radio and TV and now the internet is where all those things are going. I had some experience during my days of marketing dealing with that, and even 20 years ago, newspapers were far less important than they were then. So it may or may not be true, I'm not really sure, but newspapers really have to fight to get political ads now. It's just not that big of a deal.
But he made sure that the St. Pete Times, the Tampa Bay Times wouldn't be subject to somebody buying it and taking it over and ruining it. Can you talk a little bit about what he did to set it up?
Yeah, well, that was his philosophy dating back. He actually had that put in print back in 1947. And what he did was set up a opportunity for those purchases of the St. Pete Times to be done by the Poynter Institute. And sometimes I forget what I've seen, what I put in this. There was a statement made by someone, I think in here, that he could have had that sold to the to Yale University or some other nonprofit institute, and that could have done the same thing. But he had wanted for a very long time to set up a institution which became the Modern Media Institution, which now is the Poynter Institution, which, by the way, it's funny that it's called the Poynter Institute today, because he told all of his family and friends, if you name anything after me, I'll come back and haunt you. He did not want that. He was not a shy person, but he didn't want to be the center of attention, and he didn't want those things named after him. But he set that institution up so that it would be not only training for journalists, but also a place where he could send that institution of the St. Pete Times and the Congressional Quarterly and not be subject to the taxes that would be crippling had they done that. There was a conversation I remember hearing said that when he first valued that back in the 1947, it was worth around $7 million, and by 77 it was $150 million, and would not have been able to pay those taxes. Plus, he didn't want it to be taken over by a big corporate conglomerate. That was the main thing. You know, he liked the people at Scripps Howard and Knight Ridder, but he didn't like that form of newspaper, and he wanted it to be locally dealt with. Jim.
Walt, one of the things that, as a person who works at a library, there are all these ghost stories that in the first library named after him, that we used to have people who worked on the night cleaning crew used to claim they saw the ghost of Nelson Poynter. But you know, his presence was very strong. But one challenge that a lot of people in the community who were more conservative used to refer to the paper, of course, as the Pinellas Pravda or things like that. Yet what's so telling about the presentation you've given us is that this man was a true business person in the greatest sense. Could you speak to that a little, please?
Well, that is a battle he had his entire business life. In the 40s, 50s, and even in the 60s, various issues came up about why he should be able to, for example, buy, they touched on this, a TV station or a radio, because there were these rumors flying around that either he was a communist or a communist sympathizer or whatever. You have to keep in mind, he was a Franklin Delano Roosevelt, liberal Democrat, okay? During World War II, the Soviet Union was an ally. Nelson Poynter was extremely anti-Nazi, anti-fascist. I didn't go into it a great deal here. I will in my further presentation, but he actually was involved with the federal government in setting up counter-propaganda to the Nazis in South America for the U.S. government in Washington, and actually started that before we got into World War II. So he had a lot of involvement in these cases where he had to defend himself. He had to actually get people like U.S. Senator Spencer Holland, who's a former governor and was considered a very conservative Democrat, come to his defense when he was trying to get his radio station, get his TV station. And from the evidence that I found in the papers, he actually later, at some later date after 1953, when he was trying to get Channel 8, he and the Tampa Tribune fought over who would get Channel 8 when TV was coming here. He actually got his FBI reports, and there were reports that said that he had communist sympathizings and leanings, but these were raw FBI reports. These were just people that said this. There was no proof or evidence. Anybody who knows anything about FBI reports, they just go out and take the information down. This is what people say. They don't try and prove it. You know, they're not prosecuting you. And so some of the commissioners for the FCC took this information and actually used that to vote against the St. Pete Times and Nelson Poynter in the awarding of the Channel 8. Actually, the Tampa Tribune got it. In fact, until just this past week, the media company, Media General, who owns Channel 8 and also owns the Tampa Tribune, still owned it. And the Media General still owns Channel 8. They just spun off and just sold off Tampa Tribune. But that was one of the battles he had to fight his entire life. There was another occasion where the president of the Women's Republican Club of St. Petersburg accused him of being a communist and put it out to her membership. And he was very sensitive about that. He kind of joked a little bit about it here, and some of his friends did, but he was anti-communist, but he was a liberal Democrat in what he felt like was the fashion of Franklin Roosevelt. My experience in going over his papers and my general experience in history of Florida in the South is that if you were pro-civil rights and you weren't in favor of integration, then you were considered to be a lefty. Exactly. Okay? And the real irony is one of the most conservative members of the U.S. Senate, who happens to be from the hometown where I grew up in Bartow, Spencer Holland, actually championed, and I guess maybe this is one reason he was friends with Nelson Poynter, the amendment to the Constitution that did away with the poll tax. And that was aimed by most states at keeping black people from voting and other poor people from voting because of the poll tax. And so because he was from Indiana, even though he had lived in Florida he came back here in the 1910s, visited with his mother, and he had been in Florida for a very long time, but he was not a Southerner. And so he didn't have that sense of what race was to many people in the South. That's one reason he became a very good friend with Governor Leroy Collins, who actually ran for governor as a segregationist, but changed his views once he got to be a governor because of his Christian upbringing. He just thought that was wrong. And he and Nelson Poynter were very good friends all of their lives, as well as was he with the very conservative Senator Spencer Holland and others of that era. So,
in the earlier days of St. Pete history, there was a strong movement to make us industrialized all along the waterfront and all. And then the early St. Pete Times, I believe, with Straub and some of the rest of them, were very much against that, and
right.
helped to make what we have Parkland today.
Right. Yeah. In fact, a little bit of that shows up in the papers because his father Paul bought the St. Pete Times from Straub, and there's actually a beautiful painting that Straub made of the waterfront in 1905, and he, for whatever reason, it's not labeled, doesn't indicate why it's there, but it's in Nelson Poynter's papers, and that is the way that Straub saw this should be, that it shouldn't be industrialized the way that Tampa is or was. Tampa's trying to move away from that now, but yeah, that's a good point. And while that really was something that I guess Nelson Poynter continued to promote, that idea of a beautiful downtown waterfront and a beautiful downtown St. Petersburg, he also was very much in the idea of promoting its commercial development as well. For those of you who know anything about St. Petersburg, you remember Webb City and Doc Webb. He gives credit to Doc Webb for keeping the St. Pete Times alive during the Depression. He literally, there's records in there, he literally went over every day and collected the advertising money from Doc Webb in cash. He himself walked over to Webb City and collected advertising money in cash. I mean, that's how bad things were. In fact, a lot of companies were putting out script because they didn't have cash. And so he would actually, couldn't spend that script, so he would go over and pick up the cash from the dock. Yes?
Well, there's no way to know since Poynter's not with us, but what do you think his thoughts will be about the recent renaming of the newspaper and also what has happened to the competitor across the bay?
Yeah, that's a really good question about what's happened to the competition between this market and the renaming of the St. Pete Times. My impression from what he felt about the competition was in the early days, I've actually had reporters or previous reporters from the St. Pete Times ask me that question, have I found any evidence about what he thought about within these papers of the renaming? It was kind of traumatic to a lot of people who worked for the St. Pete Times when they changed that name. And, but my impression is that he thought that during the time he was around, and particularly, remember, it wasn't until 1971 that the St. Pete Times actually caught the Tampa Tribune in circulation. And he felt like essentially that side of the bay was their side of the bay, and that they were doing a pretty good job. And he had a pretty good relationship with the management of those papers. There's a number of letters in there. Red Pittman, who became the publisher of the Tampa Tribune in the early to mid-1970s, wrote him this really kind letter that's in there thanking him for the profuse congratulations that Nelson Poynter had given to the paper. So that competition was not really something that he thought about then compared to the way we think about it now. The bays were more separated as separate communities, and he was interested in promoting St. Petersburg and Pinellas County, and that wasn't his main concern, is trying to beat the people in the Tampa Tribune and go in and move in over into Tampa. And at that point in time, the Tribune wasn't really trying to do that here either. So, I mean, it wasn't really a concern. Now, as far as the name, he was also about this area, though, and had he seen things to be the way they are today, where the St. Pete Times is moving out across the entire area, and we consider ourselves a Tampa Bay area, not so much just Tampa, just St. Petersburg, just Clearwater. He probably, from everything I can tell, and people change over time, probably would have been okay with that. That would have made sense to him because he was about marketing and promoting his newspaper. And whatever made his newspaper successful, that's what he wanted.
What he really would have loved when Andy Cordy came up with the idea of naming the forum the St. Pete Times Forum.
Well, that would have been a great advertising coup for him. He would have loved that. That's true. I'm sure he would love it because, look, he was a businessman.
Yep.
I don't know if you caught the remark that the doctor made there when he asked him, why do you want to buy a radio? To make money. Yeah. I mean, he believed you couldn't be independent as any organization, any business, but certainly not a newspaper or a media organization if you didn't make money. And I think the Tampa Tribune's a good example of that. They've been losing money like crazy and about to go out of business, and their circulation, their quality of the people that work for them have gone away, or they've run them off. So that makes a big difference. If you don't make a profit and your business is not successful, you can't be what you want to be. And he was very worried about that. He mentioned in there, and then this piece that I had here, that he was in debt early in his business life, and he took over his father's debts. His father had a lot more problem making his enterprises profitable than he did.
Well, the first thing he had to do was take over the business from all the rest of his family members.
Right. Well, plus, I tell you one of the things, I think he talked about it a little bit here, but they financed things differently back in those days. Back in the 10s and the 20s and those periods of time, a lot of those were personal loans with notes that were due in a year or 6 months. And he actually talks about that in some other tapes that I've seen, where they tried to structure those things so one would come due in a month and the next one in another month, so they didn't all come at the same time. But he actually bought a lot of that debt from private individuals that were friends of his father that were helping him out. This is, during that period of time, that's the only way you couldn't get money out of banks. Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the demise of the Evening Independent, please?
Well, I have an interesting aspect how I view that. My wife worked for the Tampa Times, which was the afternoon paper for the Tampa Tribune up until it closed. And that was back in the 80s. Yeah. That's just an aspect of what happened to the newspaper business and to media in general. When he bought the Independent, it was losing money. He actually really just bought the name. And he felt like it was a tradition. Remember, it was the Independent that had the idea of if there's no sunshine, was it the paper's free for that day? So, and he kind of kept those traditions going. He just felt like it should go. But really, the whole time that they had the Independent, the St. Pete Times was subsidizing it. I don't find any records to indicate that it actually was very successful at any time. So it just succumbed. You know what? I don't even remember now.
1986.
Yeah, so it was just actually a little bit after the Tampa Times, which was the afternoon paper of the Tribune. Okay, for those of you who don't know, but that was just the direction the market was going in. There was nothing anybody could do about it. I don't know if there are any daily afternoon papers left in the United States. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Walt. We'll see you all next week.